Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Winter Buzz Breakfast Series. Again, my name is Ed Manning. I'm the Executive Director of Leadership Asheville, and really glad you could join us. My co-host today is Katie Cornell, Executive Director of the Asheville Area Arts Council. Katie?
Good morning again. Welcome to the first event in our four-part Winter Buzz Breakfast Series on equity and creative placemaking. In 2009, New Orleans jazz musician Wynton gave the Americans for the Arts Nancy Hanks lecture. In his presentation, which was amazing and I highly recommend you watching it, he said the arts are an expression of what it means to be human. They teach us who we are. Public art is an expression of what our community stands for. These pieces teach people what we value. They bring us together and they can divide us. Over the last year, we've faced some tough discussions. And we're not done, but we're also not unique or alone. These same conversations are taking place across the country. That is why we've lined up national thought leaders to share their wisdom with us over the next few months, followed by a community panel in April. I hope you'll be able to attend all four events. You can register at leadershipasheville.unca.edu. On behalf of the Asheville Area Arts Council, thank you for joining us today. Now back to you, Ed.
Thanks, Katie. I appreciate it. And I really want to thank Katie. She had this idea last summer and began putting it together and approached us about doing it as part of our Buzz Breakfast. And we are so glad and thankful that you have, because these are crucial conversations that our community needs to have and take action from. And we wouldn't be able to do that without our sponsors. So I really thanks to all of our sponsors today, and particularly our presenting sponsor, the Van Winkle Law Firm. So I'd like to invite up to the stage at this time, Mr. Brian Lawler, who is an attorney at Van Winkle Law Firm. Let me bring Brian on board. As I do that, let me tell you a little bit about him. As an elder law attorney, Brian assists clients in identifying resources and developing plans that enable them to live long, healthy, and active lives. He focuses his practice on elder law, estate planning and administration, incapacity planning and guardianships, and working with adults and children with disabilities. And does a wonderful job. He's licensed to practice in North Carolina and South Carolina. Please welcome Brian Lawler. Brian?
Thank you, Ed and Katie, so much. And welcome all of you for joining us today for this first conversation in the 2021 Winter Buzz Breakfast Series. Van Winkle is very proud to be a part of this very important discussion and excited that you're all here. What an awesome platform, just talking about how great it is. So my name is Brian Lawler, and I'm an elder and special needs law attorney with Van Winkle. With an ever booming and diverse aging population throughout Western North Carolina, the challenges of aging actively and with dignity and on one's own terms are becoming ever more present. Likewise, growing older, like raising a child, takes a village and to prevent the many risks that our most vulnerable confront every day. So the elder and special needs law attorneys at Van Winkle really are uniquely poised to assist families in overcoming those challenges and to zealously advocate for the protection and security of all people. Van Winkle has proudly served this community since 1907, with services covering just about every need that may arise, from trust estates and elder law to all manner of business development and operations, real estate, intellectual property, family law, and litigation of all shapes and sizes. Van Winkle has been in Asheville for 114 years and is often seen as an institution in this town. But unlike institutions that fail to accept changing landscapes and find creative adaptations to meet the needs of a modern, diverse, and evolving community, it is Van Winkle's ability to really adapt and flex to the changing needs that has allowed us to sustain a consistently reliable presence here. At Van Winkle, we make law work for you, whoever you are and whatever your needs may be. We value creative, innovative, and entrepreneurial approaches to better serve our clients and our community. So we are very honored to be a part of this dialogue and this series. We are excited to partner with all of you in the evolution of this great city. Thank you so much again for joining us today.
Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate it. And thanks so much to the Van Winkle Law Firm. It is really, your support has been truly amazing for us. I really appreciate it. Thank you. I also want to thank our sponsors who have been, our platinum sponsors who have been really helpful this year. Explore Asheville and the North Carolina Arts Council have both stepped up to really help us put on this speaker series. And again, bringing to you national level speakers for this event. It's been really wonderful to have their help. I'd also like to thank our featured sponsors. And if you didn't get a chance during the networking, I hope you will afterward. Go around and click on their banners, and there's little snippets in there. Each one has something different, so it's kind of exciting to go check out their tables and what they have. Some have some videos. They're really fun. But AV Tech, Community College, Arby's, ABL Technologies, Lenore Ryan University, their Equity and Diversity Institute. Along with them, we have the Rouleau Real Estate Group, the African Americans in Western North Carolina and Southern Appalachia program of UNC Asheville, and Young Professionals of Asheville, YPA. They also have tables so you can go and talk to the folks at the table when we get back to networking at the end of the event to get more information from them. Please check them out. Also want to thank our table sponsors, the Biltmore, Home Trust Bank, 103.3 Asheville FM, and Western Carolina University have always been big supporters of Leadership Asheville, and we really thank you for that. Leadership Asheville wouldn't exist without our sustaining partners, TD Bank, Waste Pro USA, and the Van Winkle Law Firm, who also contributes to the overall operation of Leadership Asheville. And we are very grateful for their help and support throughout the year. Likewise, our community partners, their in-kind contribution really allows us to do the work we do. And that's Blue Ridge Public, Gray Line Trolleys, and the YMCA Blue Ridge Assembly. We're very grateful for their help in allowing us to do it. And last but not least, I need to thank our Buzz planning team because they've done a fabulous job putting together this whole series. That's Katie Cornell, Susie Chandler, Michael Murphy, KP Whaley, and Lauren Yoder. Now, a couple things as we go through the presentation. I'm going to bring up the mayor in just a moment to ask her to introduce our keynote speaker. But to give you all an idea that you'll see on the left-hand side, you should have a chat function. And again, you can chat with anybody in the privately within the event just by searching for their name and clicking on their person, or you can chat with the people whose table you were just at. You're still at that table, but you're only seeing the presenters at this moment. We're in webinar view. But the third tab in there is Q&A. We are taking questions for our presenter, and Dr. Darren Waters and Aisha Adams will be moderating the Q&A section at the end. So please put your questions in the Q&A. You can also like questions that are already in there so they'll come to the top, and that will help Aisha and Darren get to those first. So please use that function. If you have any technical issues, again, please private chat Michael Murphy. He's on tech support. And down in the bottom lower corner, there's a little red button that says need help. That will actually take you to Remo support so that you can get help that way. And now it's my privilege and pleasure to introduce our mayor, who needs no introduction whatsoever. Would like to ask Esther to join us on stage so that she can introduce our keynote speaker. She is also an attorney at the Van Winkle Law Firm, and we are really glad to have her with us this morning. Esther, would you join me on stage? Turn on your camera and your microphone. There you go.
Okay. All good? You can hear me? Good. Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here this morning and to make this introduction. As many of you know, this is an incredibly timely discussion for us in Asheville, as we've been having this discussion for a long time, and we're continuing to do so now. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Mitch Landrieu. Mitch Landrieu is an American politician, lawyer, author, speaker, nonprofit leader, and CNN political commentator. He served as the 61st mayor of New Orleans from 2010 to 2018. And when he took office, the city was still recovering from Hurricane Katrina and in the midst of the BP oil spill. Under Landrieu's leadership, New Orleans is widely recognized as one of the nation's great comeback stories. And I came to learn about Mitch Landrieu's leadership when he served as the president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. He gained national prominence for his powerful decision to take down 4 Confederate monuments in New Orleans, which also earned him the prestigious John F. Kennedy Profile in Courage Award. Many of you may have heard him already speak about the issue of removing Confederate monuments. I did have that opportunity, and it has informed my decisions around monuments here in our community. In 2018, he launched E Pluribus Unum, an initiative in the South created to fulfill America's promise of justice and opportunity for all by breaking down barriers that divide us by race and class. Prior to serving as mayor, Landrieu served 2 terms as lieutenant governor and 16 years in the Louisiana State Legislature. He and his wife, Cheryl, live in New Orleans, where they raised their 5 children. So welcome, Mitch Landrieu.
Mayor, thank you so much. You know, they always do this to mayors. They say the mayor who needs no introduction, and then they try to introduce you. And it's a lovely thing to experience. But it's so great to be with you and your community in Asheville. I want to particularly thank Ed Manning, who you guys don't know this, but there's a little bit of inside a ball here. Ed is my first cousin. His mother and my mother are sisters. They love each other dearly, and I've grown up with Ed, know everything about him, but I'm not telling y'all one thing, except this. You already know that he is a spectacular human being. Between the brood that my mother and father have, we have 9 children and 38 nieces and nephews. Ed's family is bigger than ours, so we spent a lot of time together, and you guys are very, very fortunate to have him. I know that you know that. I also want to thank Katie for talking about the importance of the arts and Mr. Lawler for his sponsorship today, especially as he talks about elder care. I'm spending a lot of time with my mother and father now. My father's 90, my mother's 88. And it is just incredible not only to benefit from their joy and from their wisdom, but also it's a blessing to struggle with them through the difficulties they have when they get older. And of course, as more of our population continues to age, this is going to be a critical part. But we should never forget how important our elders are to who we are. They hold our history in their hearts. They hold wisdom that some of us will never have until we live the years that they've lived. And so it was really fortuitous that you guys are the sponsor today. And Mayor, I'm happy to hear that you get to practice law a little bit while you're the mayor. That's a blessing as well. Secondly, I love Asheville. I've been there twice. In 2018, my family spent some time up in the hills. We came down into the city and had just a spectacular time. Ironically enough, I walked by the Confederate monument that you have, and it stopped me in my tracks because it just seemed so out of place with the spirit of Asheville. So much so that I took a picture of it and kept it because of the insignia on it that said that it was put up by the Daughters of the Confederacy in honor of Robert E. Lee. And I thought that was just an interesting dichotomy from what the feel was on the streets of Asheville. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But you have a beautiful city. You can feel the vibe. I know that there is a what I call a cultural economy that's thriving in Asheville, whether it's the arts, the music, the restaurants. You can the vibe that people have towards each other. You can feel that you have a community that's loving and open. Notwithstanding the fact that, like New Orleans, you're operating in a fairly red state where you have a number of different cultures that are clashing against each other, and that's worth spending a little bit of time on. The first thing I guess I should say as we begin this discussion is that I know that we're talking about Asheville and we're talking about monuments, but the bigger question is, where are we sitting and what time are we in? What forces are there around us that have actually brought this discussion to the fore? Because it's so big and it's so deep and it goes back so far and it's so important to the future that really what we're talking about is probably one of the most difficult issues that the United States of America, I think it is, by the way, the most difficult issue, and that's the issue of race. And it's in that context that we're having these discussions about the monuments, the role that art plays, place-based development, how you build a city, how people live together, work together, play together, and unfortunately decide to hate each other from time to time. I'm a kid from the South. I was born and raised in New Orleans. I was 1960. Eddie's a little bit younger than me, but as a white male from the South, and by the way, as all of you who hail from the South, I think we have a special obligation to address this issue for the country. Not because there's not racism all over America, there clearly is. Not because there's not institutional bias in other places in the country, it is. But, and I'll speak for my state of Louisiana, we sold more human beings into slavery than any other place in the nation. And the South had a critical role to play in it. As has been said many, many times, without being too repetitive, slavery was this nation's original sin. Racism continues to this day, in my opinion, to be our Achilles heel. It is very much like a virus. It is transmitted from person to person, generally from parent to child, and it repeats itself over time and will continue to do so unless and until it's confronted and interrupted, and we decide to change. That's the short conclusion that I've come to after 60 years on this earth and growing up how I grew up. So it's worth a minute just to tell you a little bit about that, to give you some context. As I said, I was born in 1960. My father and mother have 9 children. I was the 5th child. In 1960, when I was in utero, my mother had 4 young children at home. Now, my mother is a saint, as is Eddie's mother. My mother had 9 children in 11 years, if you can believe that. I keep trying to ask her if I'm a favorite child, but she won't ever tell me. I suspect that I'm not. But she had 4 young kids at home. My dad, who didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, who grew up in a house that was 18 feet wide and 60 feet deep, whose father didn't graduate high school and whose mother only graduated 3rd grade, lived across the street from a cemetery, grew up in the inner city of New Orleans, but found himself at Loyola Law School. And after Loyola Law School, after having served in the JAG Corps in the Pentagon, came home, married my mother, who, by the way, had thought about becoming a nun and was in the convent. I never really asked my father how he got out of the convent or whether he snuck in, but that's a family story for another day. But in any event, they got married. They began to have children right away. And as I said, in 1960, my mother had 4 kids, and I was in utero. My father had gotten himself to the Louisiana legislature. And so if you can go back to 1960 and think about the era of George Wallace, Bull Connor, in Louisiana, we had a governor named Jimmy Davis, and he ran for office on the platform of segregation forever. Racism was rampant and abundant. The nation was struggling through the birth of the civil rights movement. Brown versus Board of Education had been decided a couple of years before that. And as you may recall, the Supreme Court said with all deliberate speed, but nobody anticipated naively that even today people would be pulling away from this notion of equality and diversity. In any event, in the very early months of my father's time in the state legislature, Governor Davis, being a segregation forever governor, introduced a package of bills to do that. My father was one of only 2 legislators to vote against that. And he told me the story of that night. And after he took that vote, when he went back to the hotel that he was staying in, the elevator doors opened, he got in. And before the doors closed, Leander Perez, who was one of the great racist sheriffs in the history of America, who was from Louisiana, and Willie Rainick, a congressman who also was one of the great racists of all time, stepped into the elevator, and they put their finger in his chest and said, "You're done. We're going to get you." And essentially threatened his physical life and his political life. That is what I was born into in the South. My father's best friend was an African-American gentleman named Norman Francis. You may know him now as Dr. Norman C. Francis, winner of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the longest serving president of an HBCU in America, Xavier University, that graduates more African-American doctors. That was my father's best friend when he was in law school. And his relationship with Norman formed his life and formed his view of how wrong we were in the South to treat African-Americans like property rather than human beings. Norman was smarter than my father. He was better looking than my father. When Norman married his wife, Blanche, my father and my mother, whose name is Verna, became best of friends. And they all had children all at the same time. And to this day, we are very dear friends with the Francis family. And the reason that story is instructive is because as I grew up as a white guy in the South, and I was hanging around my white friends, when they would talk about African Americans, and they would generally say pejorative things like, black people aren't smart, black people aren't fast, black people, are not prone to following the law, black people don't like God. My personal example was completely different from that. My personal experience seeing the humanity of individuals who were very dear friends to me and who loved me and cared for me helped form my conscience too. And so as I grew up at my father's knee and my mother's knee, and we had a house that was in the inner city, and our school became integrated, I watched my white friends leave because their parents didn't want their kids to go to school with black kids. And in second grade, this was when I had my first realization that something was up, because a young man named Clarence Gilroy, the first African-American kid, came into my class, but a little girl who I was kind of sweet on, even in second grade, white, didn't show up. And when I asked where she was, they said, well, their parents pulled her out of school because they didn't want her to go to school with black kids. And as a second grader, I can still remember going, I don't understand that. Part of the story is that Margaret's father was one of my father's dearest friends. My father, when he was in high school, was a pitcher on his high school baseball team of some renown. They actually won the world championship. That's how good their team was. And this guy was his catcher. And anybody knows anything about sports know that pitcher and catchers are best friends. They have to be. But my father's best friend removed his kids from the school that we all went to because of his illness with race. And so from a very early age, I began to really see and to understand and to know. And because of the work that my father did as not only a state legislator, but a city council member, where they took the Confederate flag down in 1968 in New Orleans at the request of my dad and a couple of other people, I got kind of baked into this. When my father became mayor, I was a freshman in high school, 8th grade, and the principal came to get me out of class. Usually when the principal came to get me, I was punished because I kind of got out of the way from time to time. But this time the principal had a scared look on his face and said, I need to walk you across the street to the gym. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, because there's been a threat on your life. And in fact, a woman who was challenged had called the school and threatened to kill me because my father, when he became mayor, insisted upon making sure that he honored a commitment of his life to make sure that the city of New Orleans became open, accessible to leadership from the African-American community, and began to make sure that the doors of City Hall and the public funding at City Hall was spent where it was supposed to be spent. And so that's the world that I grew up in. I later became, like my father, a state legislator. I had no idea so many years later that I would confront the same thing when David Duke, a leader of the Klan, was actually elected to the state legislature while I was there. It was watching history repeat itself. And that sordid chapter in Louisiana politics did not end until David Duke ran for governor and the Senate and got 2 out of every 3 white votes in Louisiana. And this was in 1990. I'm not in 1960 anymore. I'm not in 1930. I'm not in 1870. I'm in 1990 in Louisiana, in and around the city of New Orleans. And so, as you know, as we jump forward and you see the moment that we're in, and I'm skipping through a lot of history fast, but the point will be made. Donald Trump is a symptom. He's not the cause. He has a dark soul and the cause of white nationalism and white supremacy, this kind of insidious notion that some of us are better than others because of the color of our skin. Not an understanding that race is just a social construct that we made up to keep other folks down for our own self-preservation has permeated the United States of America since our inception. I subscribe to the fact that the United States of America is a great country. There is no other country in the history of the world that has done what the United States has done in a positive fashion. That is true. We are a country that's built on an idea. The idea is pretty simple and straightforward. The founding fathers who confected a genius of an idea that has allowed the oldest democracy in the world to stand. And that is pretty simple, that all of us are created equal, endowed by a creator with inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We are indivisible. Dr. King talks to us about, being part of a interwoven garment of destiny. All of those things are true, but it is also true that while we have worked really, really hard to get that done, that we have been blind. We have been hypocritical. We have lived in a duality. I think Dr. Ibram X. Kendi kind of has it right when he says it's not that we leap forward and we go back. It's that good and evil have been running side by side, at least as it relates to the issue of race since the day that this nation came into being, and of course, many, many years before. And so I have been shaped my entire life. I can't think of a moment in my life when race hasn't been a part of almost every decision that has been made in government, in the private sector, in the faith community, in the arts community. And it is something that in my mind that we as a country have never really looked honestly at. We have recoiled, we have denied, we have accused, but I don't think that we've ever really confronted it and dealt with it the way that maybe we have a chance to right now. And unless and until we do that, I just have a really strong feeling that our country will never be the country that we all promised each other we could be. And so the idea from my perspective is to not build the country back the way it was. That's a pledge to go back to a place that wasn't very good for so many people. It reminds me of the story, since I'm from the South and we all like to go hunting, of when my grandfather came back from hunting. And I said, Papa, how was the duck hunt? And he said, well, it depends. And I said, well, didn't the sun rise? He said, oh, it was beautiful. Wasn't the water gorgeous? Yep, it was great. I said, well, what's the problem? How was the duck hunt? He said, it depends. I said, on what? He goes, on whether you were me or whether you were the duck. And if you think about it from that perspective, any white person who has any sense in their head, if you ask a African-American person, what do you think about the past? They said, for who? And if you don't know your history, or you bought a bad history, or you bought a lie, it's easy to get yourself to a place where you say it's not a problem. But of course, what's happened since the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, is there's been a new explosion, thankfully, of a deeper and a richer dive into our history. And of course, monuments cause us to do that. It's interesting to me that when we began to think about the monuments, that so-called historians, just started yelling and screaming like a stuck pig right away, as though somehow it was against the law or irreligious to talk about something that they considered to be so sacred, which was, I thought, interesting in and of itself, because most things, as you know, in life come and they go. But these monuments were the only thing where people actually said, you not only can you not take it down, you can't even talk about it, and how dare you, because you're going to erase our history, as though their reflection of 4 years of our history somehow embodied all of who we were and what we were, especially when they weren't in context. And so as I became the lieutenant governor of the state of Louisiana, and began to understand, because a lieutenant governor of Louisiana oversees art, museum, culture, and history, the convergence and the fusion of art and history and music, and its importance to the communities that we live in and how they inform them. When I became mayor of the city of New Orleans and was in the process of rebuilding the city after having been destroyed by Katrina, literally, we got beat to death. We had to build back all of our schools physically. We had to build back our roads, our bridges. We had to build back our libraries. We had to build back our hospitals. And so it got me thinking about the physical space that we were living in. And it was interesting that Katie started off with a story about Wynton Marsalis, because Wynton happens to be a really dear friend of mine. We've been knowing each other since we were 13 or 14 years old. And although he's the greatest trumpet player in the world and maybe one of the greatest musicians, essentially what he really is a historian. And music is his medium. Jazz is his music of choice, because to him, jazz represents essentially democracy and the way democracy is supposed to work. And he gives a beautiful speech on it, which I won't try to paraphrase because I won't do it justice. But Wynton connects for us the importance of art and music, because essentially art reflects our soul. So what we choose to look at, what we choose to create, what we choose to curate, what we choose to honor as opposed to remember, is really a reflection of who we are, or more importantly, who we want to be. And so it's particularly poignant that you've asked me to talk to you guys this morning in the context of art and placemaking, but the issue is really about race. And that issue is really about how we as Americans want to live together, work together, play together, and peacefully coexist in a way that is uplifting, not oppressive, because that's essentially what race does. And if you take a minute to learn your history, and I'm talking particularly to the white people here, and you open up your eyes and you open up your ears, then you will see things that you walk by every day that you maybe not have realized have been offensive to some of our fellow Americans. That sounds like walking by a Confederate monument and asking yourself the question that Wynton asked me when I asked him to help me curate the 300th anniversary of New Orleans. So this conversation took place sometime around, 2014. Remember, the shootings and the killings at Mother Emanuel happened a couple years later, and the Confederate monuments in New Orleans came down in 2017. So 3 years before I took them down, I was talking to Wynton about helping me guide the city of New Orleans to its 300th anniversary and getting ourselves ready for the future, which is a hard thing to do, by the way. But the first question you have to ask is, what is the future? Where is the future? What do we want to be? The answer for me was, we don't want to go back like we were before Katrina, because things in the city of New Orleans weren't so great for people. We want to go back to the way we should have been if we would have gotten it right the first time. And when I said that to him, he said, well, I'll help you, but I want you to do something for me. And I said, what is it? He said, you see that monument at Robert E. Lee? We were about 3 blocks from it. He said, you need to take it down. And Jefferson Davis and P.T. Beauregard. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he then began to talk to me about their history, which, by the way, even though I kind of fancied myself as understanding and knowing a lot about race, I really hadn't thought much about the Confederate monuments. I walked by them every day. And he said 2 things to me that really kind of exploded my brain. And that happens from time to time when you hear a fantastic piece of music or you eat some food, that your brain just goes like that. He said, do you know why that monument's there? I said, no. He said, do you know who put it up? I said, no. He said, do you know that Louis Armstrong left here because of those monuments? Now that stopped me. And then, as though I wasn't stopped enough, he said, have you ever thought about those monuments from my perspective and standing in my shoes? Now, I want to kind of examine both of these things. When he told me that Louis Armstrong left, I didn't necessarily take him literally, but what he reminded me of was a speech that I had given as in my inaugural acceptance of being lieutenant governor, where I talked about the dawning of the New South versus the Old South, that diversity was a strength, not a weakness, that all of us together are much better than any one of us separate, and that there's so much to be learned from each other, so much culture, so much richness, so much intelligence, and that we had basically sent all of our best and brightest away. When I gave that speech, I wasn't really talking about the Great Migration, but when Wynton asked me about Louis Armstrong, it hit me because I had done a little bit more research, that we sent 6 million people out of the South after slavery, the best and the brightest, intellectual capital, raw material, raw talent. And we scattered them to the winds because it was too oppressive for them to stay in the South. And I started to think about how much we had lost, how much I had lost, how much our community had lost, and said, of course that's true, that any African-American that would walk by the statue of Robert E. Lee, who was put up by the Daughters of the Confederacy to be honored because of what he did, which was to lead an army against the United States of America for the cause of preserving slavery. How could any African-American walk by that and feel welcome? And I put that vision in the mouth of a 12-year-old girl. And when I gave the speech about it, I asked white people to put themselves in the position of a young girl. Now you can think of Kamala Harris. Now you can think of Amanda Gorman looking up at Robert E. Lee, who's standing there in defiance after having been erected, after having lost the war, to remind Black people that they were less than. And ask yourself whether that young girl felt encouraged. Did she feel lifted up? Did she feel welcome? Of course, the answer is no. And the reason why the answer is no is because that's exactly what the intent was. And so when Wynton said the second thing to me is, have you ever looked at it from our perspective? He really brought me to my knees. And I began really to think about getting those monuments down, because it wasn't just the monuments themselves. Those monuments are metal and concrete, and they're not very pretty, and they're not very artistically significant, especially the one that you guys have in Asheville. That's an ugly monument. And there's nothing of architectural significance to it, just like the ones in New Orleans. And by the way, there are 3,000 or more of them. So how many do you actually need to poke a finger in somebody's eye? But I began to really think about them and came to a couple of conclusions. And Mayor, if you're listening, I don't mean to be poking at you, although your leadership is required here, that those monuments in New Orleans were on city property. They were put up at a time when the Mayor Behan, who was a Confederate soldier himself, actually put them up at the request of the Daughters of the Confederacy. And if they were going to come down, it was the mayor's responsibility and the city council's responsibility to do it. We did not have, like I think you have in North Carolina, prohibitions from the state government telling you what you can and cannot do. We're a home rule city. We're not a Dillon state. And so as I started thinking about this, we came to the conclusion in New Orleans that those monuments were not reflective of the history and the culture and the diversity of the city, which had been a port city and had been a city that really valued its creativity and it valued its diversity. On top of that, I was really clear as the mayor whose job it was to stop the city of New Orleans from falling off a cliff and going into bankruptcy, rebuilding the city, refocusing it and preparing it for its future, that as the country became more diverse, that businesses and individuals that make up an economy would have any reason to want to be in a city that had hate at its heart or that revered the Confederacy in any way. That wasn't something that I thought prepared the city for its future. And so we took it upon ourselves to start a very public process to take the monuments down, which we did. Now, we went through 4 really tough public community hearings. It was pretty clear from the hearings that the people of the city, inside the city, the people that own the property that the monument's on, who actually voted for the mayor and the city council, wanted them to come down. Public polling indicated as such. But not surprisingly, we had visitors who were not from the city, didn't live in the city, lived immediately adjacent to the city, lived in the woods, lived in other states, who for some reason felt the need to tell us what we could and could not do with our public property. And so even though our city council voted to take them down, immediately thereafter, the opponents of taking them down went to court, to another branch of government. They went to our state legislature, and they actually also decided to go to President Trump. So over about a 1.5 year period of intense fighting, 7 lawsuits on the federal, state, and local level, decisions that 13 judges opined on, the president deciding not to get involved, Congress passing on it, the state legislature being neutralized because they did not come to a decision to stop us. We had a green light to take them down. And that was really only the beginning of the fight, because after we had to raise the money to do it, and after we tried to take them down, the public intimidation started, not unlike the intimidation you saw in the Capitol on the 6th, where folks from the alt-right showed up, folks seemingly exercising their Second Amendment right to carry, fairly significant assault weapons to try to intimidate us into not doing it. When we tried to hire a public contractor, that public contractor's car was firebombed. As the mayor of the city of New Orleans, who was rebuilding the city and spending billions of dollars on infrastructure, I couldn't get one contractor to give me a damn crane. And now I'm learning as a 56-year-old white guy, that even though you have power and even though you have money, there's a difference between de facto and de jure. And by law, you can have the right to do something, but if you don't have the muscle to actually get it done, people can stop you. And so that's what the insurrection was about on January 6th. I'm hoping that you're starting to see a clear line running through all of these things: the insurrection, the monuments, the opposition to the civil rights movement, lynching, all the way back to the Black Codes, Reconstruction, and then to slavery, because there is a clear line between and through all of it, and it's white nationalism and it's white supremacy. We eventually got the monuments down. And the thing that kind of jumped me off of my seat after talking about it for 2 years and thinking about it and making sure I had the legal authority to do it were the killings at Mother Emanuel Church, when Dylan Roof, citing his relationship to the Confederacy, went and took the lives of our fellow Americans who were praying. He killed them. I don't know how things could get more clearer for people. about the danger. On top of that, you may not know this because we haven't talked about it a lot, but after September 11th, when our attention was taken off of our homeland and sent overseas for terrorists that don't look or sound or talk like us, the FBI, who used to have their eye on domestic terrorism, took their eye off of it. But nevertheless, almost every FBI report has told us time and time and time again to be careful and to beware, because there are people being radicalized, especially around the issue of race in America. And you saw that manifest itself, in my opinion, on January 6th. And so, yeah, we're talking about the monuments in Asheville, but we're talking about something much, much deeper. And the question gets to be, how do we get to the other side of this? How do we really look at what's happening? How do we really think about it? And are we willing to go through it? And I say through it because this is not something you can short on. Racism is a real illness. Most people can't see it because they don't look at it. Or when you're asked to look at it, they look away. My best guess about this, I'm not a social anthropologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm just an old politician. But I sense from my political experience that sometimes it's hard for us to look at things that cause us pain, and it's easier for us to deny them than to confront them. I would just say this to my fellow Americans. This country has a great opportunity in front of it. This country has great hope. This country has great potential, but only if we deal with this issue. We have a lot of difficult issues, clearly COVID, clearly infrastructure, clearly the quality of our air and water, our healthcare system. All of these things are really critical, but one of the things that runs through our inability to find common ground is this issue of judging each other based on the color of our skin, a social construct that has poisoned us from the beginning. And I just don't think that it's possible for us to allow individuals to enjoy the opportunities, that the gifts that they've gotten from God to flourish, can do that unless until we deal with this illness that actually imperceptibly in some ways and in denial in other ways stops individuals from receiving the opportunities that are afforded for them to achieve the potential that I think that they have. And not only is it unjust, not only is it unfair to them, but the rest of us lose out too. And if you thought about it just a little bit, think about the music that wouldn't exist, the food that wouldn't exist, the science that wouldn't exist, the music that wouldn't exist. Think about how hard it was for those individuals to do what they did. I thought about this the other day when we white people do this all the time, and it should anger you. I'll give you 3 examples. Cassius Clay, Martin Luther King, Hank Aaron. Today, every white person in America runs towards those individuals and says how great they were, how much we love them, how special they were. And in every obituary of let's say Dr. King or now Hank Aaron, it says, and he was such a great guy because he overcame so much hatred and racism. And we focus on his resilience, which he certainly had, and his ability to overcome, but we never focus on why we made it so hard for them. And so I'm just always struck by how we can't finally see at some point in time what it is that we continue to do. And we pat ourselves on the back by saying, well, those individuals are exceptional. And my question is, no, yeah, they were, clearly. But how many more people are there that have that level of talent, that have that level of sheer creative ability, that could actually do so much more? How much have we left behind? How much have we lost? And I wonder why this nation doesn't bring itself to its knees and weep at what it is that we've done to each other and caused from each other. And you saw this with Hank Aaron, last week. What people don't remember, because they haven't looked at it enough, is that the last year of Dr. Martin Luther King's life, according to people who knew him best, Marion Wright Edelman and other people, said that he was depressed, he was isolated, he was hated. He had taken a position against President Johnson because of the United States involvement in the Vietnam War. And history actually, based on the comments that Robert McNamara has made later parts in his life, Dr. King turned out to be right. Cassius Clay, everybody thought he was great. Came back from the Olympics after winning a gold medal. They wouldn't let him eat in a restaurant in Louisville. Cassius Clay, one of the greatest fighters of all time, all of a sudden gets kind of completely excoriated by the United States of America because he chooses not to go to war and, in his words, kill people who had nothing against him, when the people he was fighting for wouldn't acknowledge his humanity, becomes a Muslim. Muhammad Ali gets associated with Malcolm X. And we basically set him aside until the sheer force of his personality and his talent and his life's work demonstrated that we were the ones who were wrong, not him. And so now I want you to think about Colin Kaepernick and what we've done to Colin Kaepernick, who just took a knee, not in hatred to the flag. He did it to redress his grievances against a government, to basically call our attention to something that is so obvious and real, which is that police departments and certain individuals in police departments have not been properly trained in the use of force and have used the power of the state to make African Americans' lives miserable and can't distinguish between people based on behavior, but only on places of race. And the issue of how we have to do better in our criminal justice system. That's what he did. And he lost his career because of it. And then January 6th happened, where you saw a mob of mostly white people storming the Capitol with the intent of destroying our government at the request of the President of the United States. And many people in the country called them patriots. And then now we're being asked to look away. And so as you think about talking to a young African-American kid, or any young kid for that matter, I mean, this is really instructive, white or black, and ask them whether or not they think that it's obvious that people are being treated differently who are similarly situated. They would actually just look at you and say, I can't even believe that you asked me that question. And so it's in that context that you have to think about who you are, what you are, and how you want to surround yourself. And I happen to think, just getting into basic architecture as a mayor, the way your city is designed has a lot to say about who you are. I started a not-for-profit called E Pluribus Unum. We've traveled the South. We've interviewed 800 people. We've done deep research. Essentially, our conclusion was we are the way we are because we designed it this way. Redlining, gerrymandering, voter suppression. All of these things are tools that help implement an idea that somehow African Americans are less than. They're all the same stuff. They're just different ways of getting at what that is. And those monuments were the most public, overt expression of that truth. And if that's not what you believe, that's not who you are. The fact that somebody who had power at the time and abused their power to put it up is no reason to keep them there. I actually feel more strongly about this than I did before. And I have to say that the so-called historians that put them up are guilty of historic malfeasance because they only put that up and nothing else. I don't know if you've noticed or not, but there are very few monuments to women in America. There are very few monuments to African Americans. There were stories that were never told. The only ones that we ever put up were of white guys that fought in the war to destroy the country to preserve slavery. That kind of sucks if you think about it, because it's such a lie. It's not even close to 1/9 of the truth. And so now that some of us ask them to think about taking them down, they get all uppity and they talk about contextualizing. Where was the idea to contextualize before this happened? It's not a terrible idea. It's not actually the best one, and it's not the best solution, because I do think there's clearly a difference between remembrance and reverence. We should always remember people. Every human being's life was critically important, no matter what war they fought in, no matter how they died. But reverence is quite a different thing, because reverence indicates that that person is special, that that person did something that you want other people to emulate. And I can't be clearer as a white guy from the South. I do not want to emulate Robert E. Lee in his cause to destroy the United States of America, or people who helped enable that. And as Asheville considers itself a little bit different from the rest of the state, although I have great regard for North Carolina and happen to think that we are on a march towards a more just society, to the extent that you can create a public space that reflects the totality of who you are, the richness of who you are, the depth of who you are, the color in terms of boldness and shades, and celebrate that reflects the diversity of the people who are there, you're going to be a deeper and richer place for it. Every community has its own way to express the richness and the deepness and the diversity of the people that live there. It's only from oppression where the colors don't get to come out, where the vibrancy of a community and the texture of a community and the depth of it. And this is true not just about art, it's true about music, it's true about politics, it's true about religion, it's true about faith. It's all about whether or not we're running towards each other or running away from each other. And I think that as you think about who you are as a city, you have to find the courage to do it, because this is not easy. It's hard. People will push back a lot on it. But from what I've read about Asheville, you guys seem to be really leaning into this and talking about issues that other communities don't want to talk about. I know y'all raised the issue of reparations. If you talk to most white people about this, they freak out. I mean, that's my team's research indicates that when you talk to white people, even liberal white people, they go, look, I didn't own slaves. I didn't have anything to do with it. And it's not my obligation to pay it back. All right, maybe. Let me just grant you, for sake of argument, that you weren't around back then and you didn't own slaves. And then maybe it wasn't your fault. I don't know why that's instructive, because I can tell you this, it may not be anybody's fault, but we're here now. And now that we know what the truth is, then it's our responsibility. It may not be our fault, but it's our responsibility to fix it. And it's our responsibility to fix it for everybody and for ourselves. And to repair doesn't seem, which is the root of the word reparation, doesn't have to necessarily be a direct payment. There are lots of ways to repair the damage. But I ask people just a simple question. When you were growing up, if you broke something, your mama made you fix it. If you dropped it, you were supposed to pick it up. So it doesn't seem such a radical idea for us, A, to acknowledge that there was a terrible wrong, B, to express sorrow for it, C, to express enlightenment, and D, express a commitment to make it better. Those seem to me to be very fundamental and mainstream American values. So American that it's actually written into the Constitution that we are all created equal. And if that's what we said to each other way back when, and we recognize that we haven't achieved that, what is so radical about the commitment to love each other so deeply that we actually get that right, especially if that is the one thing that will make us great? Because in my mind, you cannot be great unless you're good first. And so that's the context of the work that we did in the city of New Orleans, as a context that I'm doing with E Pluribus Unum, which of course means out of many we are one. I know that we are challenged right now, but I don't know, maybe I'm a sick dude. I just really believe in people, and I'm always hopeful and optimistic. I get tired. I get bummed out from time to time. I get completely gobsmacked by the depth of denial that we have, and just the insidiousness of the hatred that come out of people's mouths from time to time. But you also have to get uplifted by the heroes and the angels among us that just come out of nowhere in our darkest times and just give you a great sense that if you just keep pushing, if you just keep walking, if you don't let people turn you around, there's no question that we're going to get there, because that's what America's soul thirsts for. And I just think that we got to testify to that for ourselves, for our kids, and for future generations. Thank you guys so much. I'm more than happy and look forward to answering some of the questions that you have.
Hey, Mitch, I just want to say thank you again. It's been wonderful having you on. Thank you for taking the time to join us.
Sure.
There are a number of questions they have, and I want to introduce our moderators for the Q&A and moderators for all four of these speaker series that we're doing over the next 3 months. First is Aisha Adams. She is the founder of Aisha Adams Media. She's also the Asheville View. She's on tons of things, an activist in the community. Really love having her on board. Thank you. She teaches at Lenore Ryan University's Equity and Diversity Training. Great to have you with us, Aisha. Thank you. And also, I'd like to introduce Dr. Darren Waters. He's a special assistant to the chancellor at UNC Asheville. He is the executive director for the Office of Community Engagement at UNC Asheville. He's also the executive producer of the Waters and Harvey Show, the radio show on BPR radio here, the local public broadcasting station. Darren and Aisha, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you ask the questions.
Well, thank you, Ed. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you and your team with Leadership Asheville for taking up this conversation. And Mitch, I'd like to just also thank you as well for what was a comprehensive, very comprehensive presentation here. And thank you for the courage that it took to really to take this on. Aisha, I'm glad to be here with you, and I'll just let you say a few words, and then we'll go to the questions.
Awesome. I'm super excited to be here as well. It was great to hear your story. I appreciate the courage that went into telling the truth. And I know that that's difficult. And so I just appreciate being here and being able to have this conversation as well. And I'm excited about asking questions. So if you have a question, be sure to add it in the Q&A section. And also, if you're reading the questions, go ahead and upvote your favorite questions so we can ask those in the interest of time.
Well, thank you, Aisha. And Aisha has assigned me the task of asking the first question here, Mitch. So I'm glad to do that. There are a number of questions that are in the Q&A box, but I do have a question I would like to ask here at the outset. There are a number of people who have said that these conversations can go too far, that we can go too far. How do you respond to those who say, okay, if we begin to discuss the issues surrounding Confederate monuments, this is ultimately going to lead us to begin to question even the nation's founders, the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Monument in Washington, D.C. How do you respond to those people who raise those concerns?
It's an excellent question. It's one that I've thought a lot about, and a question that I got. The first thing I have to say was always look at the intent of that question. And the intent of that question is to stop. So we want to stop. And the issue is, look, don't start anything unless you know where it's going to end. That's what the gravamen of that question is. Why should, if you start, you don't know where it's going to end, otherwise known as the slippery slope. It's the best way to get people to do nothing. It's like when you say to your mama, I want to take dance lessons. Oh my God, where's this going to end? You might decide to become a dancer rather than a lawyer. No, you can't start dance lessons. What if I have music lessons? Well, it's all that. It's a fearful question to begin with. But to answer the question directly, my answer was this. Listen, nobody knows where anything's going to end in life. All right, but I know where it has to start, because I know that what we're trying to do right now is clearly correct. We'll deal with the other thing later. And let me be really specific. In New Orleans, they did the same thing. We decided to take down 4 monuments. One was Robert E. Lee, one was Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, and one was P.T. Beauregard, who was one of the generals in the Army. The other one, though, was the monument to the Battle of the Liberty Monument, which was an assault by white people against the Metropolitan Police Department in New Orleans that was biracial. And they killed a bunch of police officers. And they actually put a monument up. Well, who do you think they put the monument up to? The members of the Klan that actually killed the police officers. That was the 4th one. All right. So when we started taking those down, the powers that be that wanted to keep them up said, oh my God, if you take these 4 down, are you going to want to take down blah, 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 blah? And my answer was, listen, we can talk about those later, but it's pretty clear to me, unless you have a better defense, that the Confederate monuments need to come down now. And so you still see this. There's still 3,000 Confederate monuments up. And we have 12 bases named after Confederate soldiers. Now think about this. I just want people to think for a second. When people are intellectualizing this, do some kind of imaginative prayer and put yourself in the shoes of a young African-American man or woman who has committed themselves to defending the United States of America, and they're walking onto an Army, Navy, or Air Force base to get prepared to give this country the full measure of their life. And the name of that base that you're walking into is of a Confederate general that fought to destroy the country that you're now to go defend. It at least makes you stop for a minute and think, do I really want to walk through that door? It doesn't make you think, yeah, I'm ready to go. Let's go get something done. So if you just think about that for a second, and white people can begin to penetrate this and start to think, why do we do that when we have all of these other people that we could revere? Why do we remember that? What's the purpose of it? Then you begin really to understand that as it relates to Confederate generals, that history has rendered its verdict, and we ought to deal with this issue first. Now, because we're smart people and because we're mature, we can have a discussion, which I think is a little bit more complicated and difficult, about what we do with people that lived some time ago, that lived obviously in hypocrisy. Let's talk about Thomas Jefferson, who's the most obvious and the hardest one. If you want to talk about a tough issue, he and Sally Hemings, while he was writing All Men Were Created Equal. I mean, I think that's really worth a discussion as we talk about how, what, when, where, what was human about what he did, what was wrong. That's an important discussion, but it shouldn't take your eye off of the clarity that generals who fought to destroy the United States of America for the cause of preserving slavery have no business in the public square, or, by the way, on the courthouse steps, or, by the way, in the Capitol. I mean, because how does an American citizen who's African American believe in 1 second that as they walk up the stairs to the courtroom, in the event that they have a family member that's sitting at the bar of justice, or if they're walking into the state legislature to talk about the right to vote, or better yet, just the rights of every citizen, how could they possibly think they're going to get a good shake if the idea of that building reveres somebody who thinks that they're less than human? I mean, that seems to be the most anti-American thing that I can think of. And so the reason I'm so passionate about it, I actually get more angry about it because this seems so simple and so clear. I really can't even believe we're fighting about it. And I'm actually, the thing that ticks me off about it is that we're spending so much time dealing with this issue rather than the disproportionate impact that COVID's having on people of color, or the fact that we have a wealth gap, or we have a fact that because we're not responding to climate change, that communities of color are actually getting the disparate impact from bad water and bad air. And because unless we get that all together, none of us can actually do as well as all of us should do. This is why we ought to just kind of do this, get past it, and then move into the next thing. But the reason we can't is because there's a common theme that runs through it, and it's a common theme about race. And it's a common theme about equality. And it really kind of digs down deeper to actually who we are as a country. And so it's a symptom that we're not really treating the illness the right way. And so the simple answer to those folks is just really, it's pretty easy. I don't know where it's going to end, but I know where it's going to start. And it's going to start with me.
Thank you, Mitch. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I'm going to ask my one question, taking Darren's lead. You mentioned a lot of issues that aren't being addressed the way they should. So I want to ask you, what impact does removing the statutes have on racial inequity outcomes in cities Black people face, like the achievement gap, the pay gap, and police brutality? How do you think removing the statutes first is going to give us a big push in the long game?
Well, that's a great question. It's a good question, and it's one that's that again is a defensive question. Where's it going to end? B, Mayor, why are you focused on this? Don't you think you ought to fill the potholes? Don't you think you ought to be dealing with the police? Don't you think you ought to be dealing with all this other stuff? And why are you messing with this when you ought to be messing with that? Because those are more important. Actually, I had some African American leaders say to me, this is going to be a big distraction. We got lots of other stuff going on. Our folks are really hurting bad. We don't want you distracted. All right. I thought on that for a while. I really did. I sat on that because it was going to take some of my time, and I actually helped raise the money privately through foundations to take them down, but I had to think on it. And essentially, this was my answer. Number one, I'm the mayor of a city. I have to know how to do 1,000 things at once. Your mayor can tell you this. Your mayor's up every day, all day, probably getting yelled at by y'all when she's trying to get her laundry done, or trying to be at the store. Y'all need to leave her alone when she's taking care of personal business. But people are always on you, right? And the truth of the matter is that, if you really broke my arm and said, if you had to choose, which would you do first? It would be dealing with the deaths of young African-American men on the streets of New Orleans to gun violence. It would be healthcare. It would be COVID. It would be all of those things. However, the truth of the matter is you're forced to do all of these things at once. And again, it's another excuse for never getting to the thing. And so I told people it's just one of 1,000 things. And by the way, it didn't take nearly as much time. And guess what? It would take a lot less time if you would just quit acting out and let us get them down. You understand what I'm saying? So it's kind of like the other side having so many ways to not do the right thing that at some point in time, you have to call the question. I made a decision. This is just a kind of an informed thought that unless and until my team did it, we had been trying to do this for many, many years. Lots of other activists worked hard on this, a lot of other elected officials before I did. So I'm standing on the shoulders of lots of people. I certainly didn't do it by myself, but it was just, there is a moment when it's possible. Not just that it's right and it's the good thing to do. You have the practical problem of actually getting it done. And I think that y'all have some challenges there in Asheville. I'm guessing, I'm not from there, I'm not an expert, but if you're in a state where the state gets to tell the city what to do, you may have prohibitions for you taking it down. If you need council votes, you may have a council that doesn't want to vote for it. So there are practical reasons that timing is important. I just think that at some point in time, when you can, that the city, when it can choose, should choose to adorn itself in positive, uplifting, unifying things. Or if you're going to have something that reminds you of a bad part of your past, that you contextualize it and say, by the way, if we're going to keep this monument up because of this person's actions, X thousands of people were killed, were raped, or were separated from their families. If you're going to contextualize it right. Don't just go, and oh, by the way, I know the statue is 60 feet high. We'll put a little plaque that's 3 by 3 on the bottom that says, yeah, but they want really all that. You understand what I'm saying? But nobody, when I started talking to the historians who wanted to keep them up about contextualizing, that contextualization wasn't like the way I would contextualize it, where they take it and turn it on its head. And by the way, that could possibly be done. A lot of artists from around the country have taken some of these monuments and turned the meanings on their head. It's the message that you want to send. It's what it reflects of the community that you're in. And by the way, the next hit is, well, aren't you taking down history? The answer is absolutely not. You can't change history by taking a monument up or putting it down. The only thing you're doing is deciding how you want to remember that history. And I would just say that you ought to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, not a little bit of the truth that turns out to be a lie by omission. Because that's essentially what those monuments are. They're a lie by omission. Because they only tell about some guys that had one side of 4 years of our history. And they forget everybody else that died, everybody else that had anything to do with it, anybody else that defended the country, especially Union soldiers that were African American. And by the way, why does every monument that we have to be about war? I'm okay with some of it. I'm just saying, like, where's the totality of our history for our historians? Where is the richness of who we really are, so that young children can look at wanting to emulate, what has occurred before. And so I got a problem with historians that have narrow memories.
Well, Mitch, we could go so many ways here. There are a number of really good questions here that have come in. And one that I have been looking at, and that is at the top, it deals with the issue, the phrase that you use, this illness that we have with race and racism in this country. And so the questioner is asking, I'm curious, how do you view treatment and intervention for those in denial that racism is an issue for our nation and our communities? How do we deal with that?
Well, that's when I don't know the answer to that. I have lots of ideas about it, but as a student, that's what E Pluribus Unum, my organization, is trying to find out. How actually do we penetrate? How do we talk? Who do we talk to? Race is a very hard issue to talk about. We're not using common language. For example, defund the police. This is a perfect example. Here's a phrase that means tons of things to tons of different people. People who hate it will take it and turn it into something that the people who said it don't intend it to be. People who said I don't really mean that. In politics, if you're explaining a phrase, it generally means you might want to think about saying something else. That's one. There are 1,000 things on the left or the right. Death panels, which is something the right used about the Affordable Care Act. So one of them is language. Secondly, white fragility is something that has been talked about. That's kind of a pejorative way to say it, but talking about race is uncomfortable for people, and we've never really learned how to do it in what I would say a loving way is the best way to do it. A way where we're not really challenging people's intent. I think it's pretty clear that hatred has always been with us. It's clearly not true that every white person is a hateful racist. I think it's probably true that a good portion of us are ignorant or unknowing or really haven't been sensitized. Let me give you a story. I'll tell you a story about my mama. Now, my mother's a saint. My mother's going straight to heaven. I hope so, because otherwise I'm not going to get there. This woman had 9 kids in 11 years. She's got 38 nieces and nephews. She goes to church every day. I mean, she's a saint, okay? But she's a white woman from the South, and she's 88 years old. And when I started taking these monuments down, besides the fact that she was she was worried about my personal safety, which all mamas do, and she said, "Oh, baby, don't do that. You know, people are going to yell at you and scream at you, and you know, and hurt you." She said to me, "I don't think I'm for you doing that." And I said, "Really?" I said, "Well, you know why?" And she said to me that, you know, all I can remember about those monuments. Now, this is Lee Circle, and y'all are not from New Orleans, but y'all know what Mardi Gras is. All the Mardi Gras parades went around Lee Circle. So, and Mardi Gras is a family event. So families stay out there. They go camp, they barbecue. It's an annual event. My mother said, all I remember is that's where my daddy took me to enjoy Mardi Gras. And so for her, it was just a place. It was just a thing. It was unattached to any of the history. But her history was that she and her daddy loved each other in that space. And so I was taking something away that had nothing to do with the reason why she thought I was taking it away. So I realized that for a lot of people, that was an inanimate object that came to reflect something else, but they never really knew what it was. That doesn't excuse their ignorance. The second thing she said was, I said, "Mom, I'm gonna take them down anyway." And then I wrote the book. And when I wrote the book, she said to me, she goes, "I read your book." That's a weird thing for a mother. She didn't say, "Oh, honey, I read your book. It was great." She said, "I read your book." And then she stopped. And I said, "All right." And she said, "I'm going to assume, because you're my son, that everything in that book is true." And I said, "Yes, ma'am, that's a fair assumption." Now, in the book, I talked about the history of the monuments, why they were there, where they came from. To answer Wenton's question, do you know where they came from? Do you know who put them up? Do you know why they were there? And my mother looked at me, and I want you to think about this now. I'm her son, and I'm looking at my mama, but she's all of a sudden starting to look like a child, and I'm starting to look like the parent. She says to me, "They never taught us that in school." I never knew all of that stuff. And then my heart kind of melted a little bit and got a little softer. And I don't mean this as an excuse, but it is something that we all have to consider. That in fact, people did not get the kind of information that they needed, that actually the cult of the lost cause and the rewriting of the history books and the way the GI Bill was designed and the way redlining happened, it was ubiquitous, and it was not invisible, because clearly you could have seen it if you worked hard, or somebody could have pointed it out. But what if they told you that what you were looking at is not true? I just want to bring your mind right now to January 6th. And I want you to bring yourself to 45 members of the United States Senate saying you didn't really see what you thought you saw last week. That's the beginning of the myth of the lost cause. It's the new myth. It's the same thing that happened after the Civil War. And so now you have to sit there and think, man, is it possible that we actually historically ignored and denied? And the answer is absolutely yes. And we did not give voice to the real things. And when you talk to white people about slavery, we generally kind of get to, well, there was slavery and there were plantations and people were sold into slavery. And there were, you know, good plantation owners and bad plantation owners. Let me tell you what we don't hear: rape, beatings, killings, lynchings, separation of human beings, cutting pregnant women open who were hanging by their feet, talking about it like that. When you start to talk to people about it like that and say, listen, let's talk about forced labor camps, not let's talk about plantations. Let's talk about what there really was. Let's not romanticize it. Let's look at what we did. That's harder for people to look away from. Then people not naturally say, because this is a great human response, but it wasn't me. And it wasn't even somebody that I might have been related to. You say, yeah, that's probably true, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. And that doesn't mean the consequences don't exist today. Well, I can't see the consequences existing today. In the world that I live in, doesn't everybody have the same rights as before? Well, no, actually you don't. Let me point it out to you. See, that's the process of open-mindedness, of education. But to make the bigger point here, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, Dr. William Barber always talks, as did Dr. King, about redemption, about forgiveness, about reconciliation. And reconciliation is an interesting thing because it's not cheap grace. I'm sorry and I forgive you. I mean, that's the beginning and the end. But sometimes there's 100 those two things. Sometimes the I'm sorry never comes, the acknowledgement never comes, and then I forgive you can't come. And so the question is, how do we get to an acknowledgement of what happened, a recognition, a reckoning, an awakening, a commitment to change, and then a forgiveness? How do we? And so this is a question. I agree with most people that racism is something that white people need to deal with because we're mostly the ones in power. I mean, that's just factually true. If you look at the presidency, if you look at Congress, if you look at the banking, if you look at all the power structure, white people mostly are in power. And if it's an issue of using power appropriately, it's the people in power who have to change. But it is also true that at some point in time, somebody is going to have to say, and I forgive you. There's going to have to be a, well, we're past it. How do we get past it? It's going to require both. Clearly, one has to come before the other. And I think the challenge that we have with each other, and we're going to have to practice this, is to figure it out person to person, family to family, community to community, and then institution to institution, whether it's the church, the government. But the big part is to recognize that we've done wrong, to know that we can be better, and to commit ourselves to finding a pathway and to try. And I say this, God, help me be patient, but hurry up. All right. Try to do both of those things at one time and always give people a way to come to you, because many, many, many white people now are really, I don't want to say finally, but it's penetrating more today than it has. We just have to stay committed to it. And when there's a clapback, and it's clearly coming now, we say, we're just not going back there. We got to go get it right this time and do it the way we should have done it, because it's going to hurt all of us. Those are the thoughts that kind of permeate the work that we're trying to do.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
I feel like I'm swimming in a dark swamp and you can't see.
Right.
That's what it feels like.
And Mitch, and I'll pass it back to you, Aisha, but you make me think of two books that I have been contending with for a while here. And one is by David Reif, which is called In Praise of Forgetting. And I've recently began reading Lewis Hyde's book, A Primer for Forgetting. And the subtitle of that book is Getting Past the Past. But one of the themes in that book is that he addresses the fact that we can't get past it until we deal with it. So I think that, people who are really wanting to dig deep and follow the path that you're talking about here, that those books would be very instructive to kind of.
Yeah, let me just make this brief comment then about this issue. And I've made an allusion to the fact that racism is like a virus. For anybody that's had a near-death experience in their life, a child that's sick, you go to the doctor walks out and says your daughter is deathly ill, from cancer, and you got to do surgery and you got to do chemo and you got to do radiation. Besides the fact that your whole life stops in that moment, you hate the doctor for telling you that. And then the doctor says, I got to give your daughter medicine that's going to kill everything in her body. But if I don't do that, she's not going to have a chance to live. You hate the stuff that he's going to give her. You hate the fact that she has to go through it. You have to process, how am I going to get to the other side, and recognize that there has to be a treatment for it. But if you just get mad at the doctor for telling you it is, and you leave because you don't want to go through the pain, then there's no life at the end of that. And it's really not unlike that in many, many ways. It's perfectly understandable that you get upset. It's perfectly understandable that you get angry. It's perfectly understandable that you had something introduced into your life that wasn't there the day before, that you had walked by. But it's the next thing that I find a little bit interesting, that we continue to walk by it at the risk of our nation dying. And I think that you can see some of that. And I say that I love our country. I love it. But I love, as James Baldwin said, that's exactly why I criticize her, because I love her so much. And one of the things that I've really kind of been blessed with is as this summer has come, the deeper reading and the voices that we've been able to find that maybe people didn't pay attention before. Jimmy Baldwin, Dr. Eddie Glaude reminds us, was one of the great clarion misters, but we dismissed him because I think he was an African-American, he was gay. Back in the 60s, even the leaders of the Black community didn't want to hang out with him until, at some point in time, they became closer friends with him. And so some voices were dismissed, but, art, transcends time. And so does truth. And so you find these voices. Frederick Douglass, for example, the country's beginning to kind of wake up to, not Alexander Hamilton, who was great, And thanks, Lynn Miranda and those guys for telling us about it. But Frederick Douglass, who was clearly one of the founding fathers of the country, is now his voice is getting louder and deeper and more poignant. And we're beginning to have a deeper discussion about the richness of people that live this. And by the way, I don't think North Carolina is much unlike Louisiana. White people forget that right after the Civil War, that a lot of southern states had prominent African Americans in positions of power. We had 2 African American governors in Louisiana in the 1860s, Oscar Dunn and PBS Pinchback. Mm-hmm. People here don't think, oh, we had black people that ran the state. Yeah, we actually did. Then we threw them out. Then we hung everybody. I mean, I'm being broad, but that's what lynching was about. Right? Sending a message. Besides the exact killing, it was sending a message about what you can't become, and don't get ahead of yourself.
Absolutely.
Well, we are nearing the end of our conversation, and there's so many good questions, but I feel like the most important question is, as we continue our journey here in Asheville, how do we continue to follow you and your thought leadership and connect with you as we do our own work?
Well, first of all, my team is always available to do anything we can to help. But, a lot of this stuff has to start on the ground where you are. It's got to start where your feet are at. It's like I like to say, every community has to change itself from the inside out. And it really, you got to make sure that you're telling your kids the right stories. Narrative, that's really important. You have to make sure that in the interpersonal relationships that you have, that you guys are interacting with some kind of fealty towards each other in the community. And it doesn't matter what the percentage of African Americans are. Actually, the smaller the percentage, the more important it is for the white people to act. And if you look at your statistics. Look at your statistics about what the home ownership is in Asheville. Look at your stats about the health disparities. Look at your stats about who gets loans and who doesn't get loans. Look at your disparities in the schools that you go to and which ones are succeeding and which ones are failing, and look at the demographics in the schools. And I think that if you're an honest person, you will see that African Americans in Asheville are way the heck behind. And they're in situations that are less optimal than where white people are. And then ask yourself, well, why is that really true? Is it really because there's something wrong with those black people? That's not the answer. That's just wrong. And so then you start have to asking yourself, well, why is it that way? And what are the systems that help make it that way? And if we can redesign the systems, how do we actually do that? And how do we do it in housing? How do we do it in education? How do we do it in healthcare? What you're going to find is that each one of those different areas might be a little different, but the differential comes from the same idea, which is that, well, maybe we're not all created equal, or we're not all treated equal. And so then you have to say to yourself, this is who Asheville is. This is what our principles of governing are. This is what our ethos is, and we want to live. And if the state doesn't want to come along with us, to the extent that we can't make them, we can't. But we can determine our own destiny, and we can do it from neighborhood to neighborhood, church to church, city hall to the ground, playground to playground, and let it be an oasis. And let me say this, I'm 100% sure that once you do that, a lot of people are going to come to Asheville. Because in 2040, when the country's majority minority, I'm telling you, I know this like my name is Mitchell. Every organization that stays white and insular is going to go away. And it's going to get smaller, and it's going to get sadder, and it's going to get harder. Every institution that opens up and becomes multicultural, that invites white people and black people, rich people, gay people, straight people, that is the community that's going to flourish. Because that's the way life is. And you can try to keep it back, but like trying to control water will have its way with you. And so will demography. And you can push it back, or you can embrace it. Embracing it's a much better way for us to go as a country.
Well, Mitch,
I appreciate that. I appreciate you talking about the economic benefit. I think that a lot of times when we talk about race, people think it's just a moral discussion, but it's also an economic discussion. It's a health discussion. It's a, we're better together. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mitch. I wish we had more time to just be in conversation and to get to some of these other questions. But thank you so much for what you're doing. Thank you for your willingness to stay engaged in the conversation with us. And we'll look forward to continuing the conversation. Well,
you guys, thank you all so much for having me. It's been a real blessing. Ed, thank you. I love you. and right on Asheville. Y'all keep going.
Mitch, I can't thank you enough for joining us. We have tons of questions. Unfortunately, I can't get to all of them. So I will keep my promise to have you back to Asheville, especially when COVID recedes and we can actually be in the same place.
I'm coming. Y'all invite me to Asheville where we can hug each other. I'm coming back, but I need some beer too. I heard y'all had some good.
We got a few.
We can get some beer.
A little bit.
So I'd love to show you around and take you out, and we'll make things happen as soon as we can make it safe.
A good hamburger and beer will do it.
There you go. Yeah, I really appreciate this is a difficult conversation and one that we absolutely need to get into. And that you mentioned the awakening, and you're so right. I think it struck me when you talked about Colin Kaepernick taking a knee. And in my mind, I flashed to that scene, and then I flashed to the scene of Officer Derek Chauvin taking a knee, and the stark contrast between the two, and what we as a country need to do to step up. And like you said, it's insidious and runs all the way through to the events of January 6th. And these are the conversations that are difficult, but most important for us to address first. And thank you for kicking us off in this.
Eddie, I would just say one final thought: be hard on the problem and soft on the people. That's kind of a helpful way to go forward, especially on this most difficult issue for us. But look, God bless you guys. Thanks so much for having me.
Amen.
I'll come back.
All right. Thanks,
Thank you so much.
We'll see you. Peace.
Thank you.
So our conversation continues in February on the 18th with Paul Farber from Monument Lab. Monument Lab recently received a grant from the Mellon Foundation to catalog monuments across our country. They also have been leading conversations in what should go into the selection of monuments. So I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation in February, and I hope you'll all join us.
Yeah, please do. And the link is on our website. I'd really want to thank Darren and Aisha for agreeing to not just moderate this one, but to moderate all four and to bring your voice and your expertise in. So thank you for taking the time this morning to join us and be with us. Thanks again to our presenting sponsor, the Van Winkle Law Firm, to our platinum sponsors, Explore Asheville and the North Carolina Arts Council, to all of our featured sponsors. And we're going to shift back to conversation mode. So those of you who are still with us, you can network and say hello to some of the friends and meet maybe some few new people. But please do go visit the sponsor banners and check them out and say hello. Thanks to our table sponsors, the Biltmore Home Trust Bank, 103.3 Asheville FM, and Western Carolina University. We really appreciate you guys making this so we could keep this free and open to the public, because it is an equitable conversation that needs to happen. We look forward to seeing you in February, and please take time and mingle amongst yourself. We're going to go back into that conversation networking mode now. Thank you.